Hi again, everyone. Welcome to History 103, week number 3 for the summer of 2020. Week number 3 of 8, so we are now thoroughly getting into the full swing of things, halfway through the course once we finish week number 4, so that's pretty exciting. I'm recording this video before I've read any of your weekly responses for week number 2, and before I've read most of your primary source discussions for week number 2, so I'm not going to be able to give you any feedback on those. Be sure to check the separate video, the weekly review or the weekly recap, where I'll talk a little bit about what was done well in our discussions and our weekly responses and what could be done a little bit better. Instead, this is the first of 4 lectures for week number 3. We tack on an extra lecture to this week because it's important to understand the political backgrounds of some of the revolutions I'm going to talk about. Our major theme for this week is Atlantic revolutions. The first week we talked about, major theme being empire building. The second week we talked a little bit more about empire building, but also specifically about the construction of race within Atlantic empires. And now we're looking at Atlantic revolutions. And because most of us went to school in the United States, you're all probably familiar with the first major revolution within this period of Atlantic revolutions, which is the American Revolution. So some of you probably have a background in the American Revolution. It's my historical specialty. My dissertation, my research topic is on the American Revolution, specifically women in the American Revolution. However, we're all a little bit, I think, less familiar with the French Revolution and even less familiar with the Haitian Revolution and the Latin American Revolutions. And all of these revolutions, which span a period from about 1775, the beginning of the American Revolution, through the mid-19th century, through the 1880s, really, when abolition kind of gets fully into swing in some of the last places in Latin and South America where slavery existed. This period that we know as the Age of Revolutions is really key to what we're talking about in week number 3. So you'll see here we have 4 lectures, each with their own specific questions, and this is lecture number 1. Lecture number 1 is a crash course. I'm going to move very quickly. There is no way I'm going to be able to do proper justice to all the different events that I'm going to be talking about. What do I expect from you? Take a few notes, pause this every now and then. There's some text, a lot more images. Try to take a couple notes on what I'm saying, but really I envision lecture number 1 to be kind of a buffer background in the political history that sets up the Age of Revolutions. That is, how are we supposed to really fully understand the Age of Revolutions if we don't understand what was being revolted against, right? We have to kind of set a political background in order to thoroughly understand what the Age of Revolutions was. So that's why this driving question is, what do historians mean when they talk about the Age of Revolutions, which is roughly 1775 to 1826, but like I said, you can trace it all the way through the 1880s. And how did it begin? Right, and that's our driving question for this lecture. In lecture 2, we'll look at the American Revolution. Lecture 3, we'll talk about the French Revolution. And lecture 4, we'll talk about the Haitian Revolution, Latin American revolutions, and we'll sum it all up. So here on our map, we're going to be mostly focused on the European continent for our background, because I envision this background to be mostly a discussion of European political history from 1492, right, from Columbus's voyage straight through 1763. Which is the end of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, as it's known in North America. So we do kind of look at North America. We'll also talk about the Indian subcontinent a little bit, but for the most part, this political background is focusing on the European continent. And here's an important slide that when you're reviewing these slides that I post, you might want to come back to as you're kind of reading this chapter and thinking about the different revolutions. This is a very rough and just general outline of political history timeline from 1492 to 1763. And like I said, that's a huge chunk of time. And there's a lot going on during this period that I do not list in this slide. However, I'm tracing Western Europeans, specifically the colonizing nations, so France, what becomes Great Britain, and Spain. I'm really looking at those nations and a political history of that area, of Western Europe, in order to understand the Age of Revolutions. Because these revolutions that occur within Western Europe. You don't have the same, although there are some similarities, but you don't have the same type of revolutions occurring in, say, Russia during the 18th or 19th century. You do get one, but it's in the 20th century, right? Same with Eastern Europe. You'll have revolutions occur there, but they're not until a little bit later. There are some in 1848 throughout all of Europe, and some people consider that part of the Age of Revolutions, but these revolutions are largely industrial revolutions. So we'll talk a little bit more about 1848 and the revolutions in that period when we talk about industrialization. So what is our political timeline? I'm going to move through all of these events, basically all of these events in a couple of slides. So I'll just give you a quick little rundown. We're not going to talk about 1492 at all because we've already covered this moment. 1492 is when Columbus, quote unquote, discovers the New World. And one of the large political outcomes of Columbus's discovery is that even though Columbus was an Italian, Cristobal Colombo, he sailed for Spain. And this meant that the Spanish were the first colonizers of the New World, and it created tremendous amounts of wealth for the Spanish kingdom, meaning that Spanish forces were empowered to go on and conquer huge portions of southern Italy and also the Netherlands. So this discovery of the New World doesn't just create a Spanish empire in the Americas, but also leads to a conquest of Europe. The Protestant Reformation begins shortly after Columbus's voyage in 1517 when Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, and this will create new kingdoms that are Protestant and Catholic and new rivalries. In 1588, the English are going to defeat the Spanish Armada, which creates a very slow but steady decline of Spain and an increase in power of England and eventually Great Britain. 1648 is the Treaty of Westphalia. This ends the Wars of Religion, or the 30 Years' War, and creates a new system of government, what's called absolute monarchy in Europe, and we'll talk a bit about that. I combine 1642 to 1651 and 1688, the Glorious Revolution, into one slide, but basically there's a civil war in England that is a war about how the monarch is going to govern the people. And ultimately, in 1688, what occurs is that a new king and queen come to power in England. They're actually brought over from today what's Germany, at the time it's part of Orange, Kingdom of Orange. They're brought over from the continent, and they become king and queen under the rules that they have to also accept Parliament's authority. So they're not absolute monarchs. Instead, they rule alongside Parliament, and we'll talk a little bit about that. 1707 is when the English and Scottish parliaments merge. So that's when we stop talking about England and we start talking about Britain. This is something that students always confuse. Like, when is it Britain and when is it England? Well, everything before 1707, there's Britain, there's Scotland, right? There's Ireland. But after 1707, it's okay to talk about all of those portions as Britain, Great Britain, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll end off our political history run through, our fly through, with the 7 Years' War, where Great Britain controls almost all of North America, right? They capture it from France in particular, also portions of the Indian subcontinent. So we're going to move very quickly through this. Our first major event that I want to just talk briefly about is 1517, the Protestant Reformation. You'll see here Martin Luther, that image on the left. He nails his 95 Theses. He's a Catholic priest who has objections specifically to the Pope's rule in Rome and certain laws that the Catholic Church has created to forgive sinners, especially the sale of indulgences he has a problem with. And he begins a transformation in Christianity that is really a splintering of Christianity, that the Catholic Church will remain. It actually reforms. There's a counter-reformation, and the Catholic Church does enact some reformations, including getting rid of the sale of indulgences. However, Luther goes on to found Lutheranism, there's Calvinism, there's Quakerism, there's baptism that will come a little bit later. There's all sorts of different Christian splinterings. But perhaps for the purposes of this class, the one that's most important is the creation of the Anglican Church, which is led by King Henry VIII when he wants to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess, in 1538. That will create the Anglican Church in England. And this is a really important moment because it creates a divide between the Pope in Rome and the monarchs of England that has a very kind of long and drawn out history that lasts well through the 18th century, when there's still a division between Catholics in England and Protestants in England. So this transformation of Christianity is our first political moment when we're talking about the Age of Revolutions. The next one comes in 1588, so not that much longer after the Reformation, and it's also a product of the Reformation. Catherine of Aragon was a Spanish princess, and when Henry VIII gets divorced from her, which is not allowed by the Catholic Church, it not only divides England from Rome, but it also divides England from Spain. And remember, I mentioned that Spain is the most powerful economic and military force in Europe after the discovery of the New World. And in 1588, they launch an armada, possibly the largest European fleet ever assembled up to that point, to invade England. And the ruler of England at this time is Elizabeth I. You can see her picture down there. She is the daughter of Henry VIII. She knows she's outnumbered, but the English have one thing in their advantage. That is, they understand how the English Channel works. And a storm whips up. They call this the Protestant wind, or the wind of England, in the English Channel. The Spanish Armada is scattered, and the English will actually defeat the Armada. They'll sink a ton of ships. The rest of the Armada will have to sail north around the north coast of Scotland. More of it will wreck across the coast of Ireland. But this defeat of the Spanish Armada means not only is England spared from being conquered by Spain and probably reverted back to Catholicism, but it also begins a very slow demise of the Spanish Empire. This defeat was really paramount in bringing down Spain, although Spain isn't really totally defeated as a global empire until the 1890s, when the United States defeats Spain in the Spanish-American War. Another event is 1648, so we're into the 17th century now, and a decisive moment where the European powers agree to end the wars of religion. We're still talking about ramifications from the Protestant Reformation. But in 1648, the European nations agreed to create a new system of government throughout the European continent. Each ruler, right, each monarch will be absolute in their own kingdom, meaning the King of France is the absolute authority in France. The King of Spain is the absolute authority in Spain. Within what is now Germany, there's a whole bunch, as you can see on this map. There's a mess. Munster, Bohemia, right, Austria is part of this at the time, Hamburg. There are a whole bunch of kingdoms, but within these kingdoms, princes and other sovereigns are absolute powers within their kingdoms, meaning that they have the complete and total say. And this brought an end to the war of religions because one of the powers of these kings was to decide for themselves what religion, what Christian religion, their kingdom was going to follow. And this brings about an end to the wars of religion because it meant that France could declare itself once and for all a Catholic nation, whereas Britain could declare itself a Protestant nation, and the two were allowed to coexist without the influence of the other. So the Treaty of Westphalia creates this new balance of power, right, where the monarchs within their own kingdom are allowed to determine the fate of those nations. Within England, there's actually a period of turmoil going on at the same time. There's a civil war going on that's basically about, and the English Civil War is incredibly complex. You can read tons and tons about it if you like. I'm going to boil it down to its basic elements. It was about what powers the king had and did not have. And ultimately what happens is a Stuart king, Charles I, is going to be beheaded. He is the first monarch in Europe to be executed. And this is a turning point in European history. He's followed by a dictator, Oliver Cromwell, who the English people don't like either. They've got rid of the king, but exchanged one king for a dictator, and a Puritan dictator at that. He bans things like Christmas. Incredibly unpopular. And ultimately what the English people decide is that they're going to invite new kings over. William and Mary of Orange. They're going to invite them to sit on the throne so long as they agree that they're going to rule alongside Parliament. And so what you have in England after 1688 is the creation of an entirely new government. It's still a monarchy, but Parliament is very much involved in dictating how that monarchy can operate. And this means that the people have a direct say. So why does all of this matter? Well, if we jump ahead after 1688 to 1756, right, almost a century in the future, a major war occurs between the two new powers, right? Spain has been declining since 1588. France and Great Britain have been increasing in power, and they go to war multiple times in the early 18th century. But the climactic, pinnacle of these wars is the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, as it's called in North America. And ultimately, the outcome of this war is that England, or Great Britain now, is victorious over France. They gain all of French North America. They also gain control of coastal India, and they also allow themselves to operate independently from the rest of the European continent. Great Britain has defeated France and asserted themselves on the global stage. Why is this important? Because we go to the American Revolution next, and the American Revolution is an exact outcome of this 7 Years' War. Thanks for the whirlwind.